All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're tackling a topic that's both fascinating and honestly pretty disturbing. We're going to be looking at the connection between pollution and premature deaths.
Yeah, definitely a sobering topic for sure.
We've got this document here called Matinya, and it really delves into the nitty-gritty of water, air, and soil contamination.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense read. It really paints a very clear picture of just how big of a role pollution plays in a truly shocking number of premature deaths worldwide.
Well, that's actually a perfect place to jump right in, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, right off the bat, this document highlights a statistic that's just mind-blowing. A university study found that a staggering 40%, that's 4 out of every 10 of premature deaths globally, are linked to pollutant in our water, air, and soil.
Wow, 40%.
I know, right? It's
Yeah.
a figure that should give us all pause.
That number really puts things into perspective. It's not just some abstract problem we're talking about here.
Exactly. It's impacting real people's lives in a very real and devastating way.
And it's not distributed evenly, is it?
No, not at all. It disproportionately impacts developing countries. I mean, when you think about it, it makes sense, right? They often lack the resources and infrastructure to combat these issues effectively.
Right, of course, yeah. But, I mean, what are we talking about here specifically when we say lack of resources and infrastructure?
Well, a lot of it boils down to access to basic necessities, things like clean water and proper sanitation. This document, for instance, points out that over 1.1 billion people, according to the World Health Organization, that is, don't have access to clean drinking water.
That's hard to even fathom. Over 1 billion people.
I know, it's just staggering. And think about what that means on a daily basis. These people are forced to use the same water sources for everything, drinking, washing, even disposing of waste.
Oh, wow, so the same water.
The same water, it creates this incredibly dangerous breeding ground for disease.
So then it's no surprise that, as this document points out, 80% of the world's infectious diseases are linked to contaminated water. I mean, it's not about inconvenience at that point, right?
No, not at all. It's about survival.
Yeah, exactly. So what are we talking about here in terms of specifics? How does this lack of infrastructure, how does it actually impact people's health?
Well, without proper water treatment, harmful bacteria and pollutant basically run rampant. It's like an open invitation for disease. You see a whole range of illnesses pop up, diarrheal diseases, which are, sadly, one of the leading causes of death in children under 5.
Oh, wow.
I know, it's heartbreaking. But then you also see more chronic conditions like cholera and typhoid fever.
Right.
It's just this constant looming threat to people's health and well-being.
And it's not just water either, right? I mean, this document also goes into air pollution, both indoor and outdoor, as another major threat. And it was particularly striking, I thought, the section on the dangers of open stoves and poor ventilation in developing countries.
Yeah, I know. It sounds almost dystopian.
It really does.
It's like something out of a sci-fi movie where the very air you breathe is toxic.
Exactly.
But it's a very real and harsh reality for millions upon millions of people. Imagine having to constantly breathe in smoke, day in and day out, filled with all these harmful chemicals and carcinogens.
Oh, gosh.
It's like, like being stuck next to a campfire 24/7.
Yeah.
The toll it takes on their lungs is unimaginable. It's no wonder lung cancer is so prevalent in these regions.
It's hard to wrap your head around sometimes. And the thing is, air pollution isn't just a problem in developing countries either, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. It's a global issue.
I mean, I remember being in Los Angeles a few years back, and the smog was so thick, it felt like you could cut it with a knife.
Oh, yeah.
It was unbelievable.
It's crazy, right?
And speaking of smog, the document uses Beijing as another powerful example. Cancer is now the leading cause of death there, and only 1% of residents breathe clean air on a daily basis.
It's wild. I mean, it really makes you think about how interconnected we all are. What happens in one part of the world can have a ripple effect across the globe.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is that the document also points out the transboundary nature of air pollution, like acid rain, for example.
Right.
Industrial emissions in one country can lead to acid rain in neighboring countries, and that's exactly what's happening in places like Japan and Korea, which are being impacted by pollution originating elsewhere.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a real problem, and it raises the question of responsibility, doesn't it? I mean, who's accountable when pollution generated in one country impacts the health and environment of another?
That's a really good question. It's complex. And it also makes you think about the products we consume every day and how they're produced. Where do these emissions come from? What are the environmental costs of our lifestyles?
Absolutely. And that actually ties into another critical point this document raises, soil contamination.
Right.
It talks about how pollutants like metals and pesticides can seep into our food supply.
Right, which has obvious health implications. But what about some of the less obvious dangers of soil contamination?
Well, one that often gets overlooked is its impact on ecosystems. These pollutants disrupt the delicate balance of the soil, affecting everything from microorganisms to plant life. And that can have a cascading effect,
Such as?
such as a decrease in biodiversity, reduced agricultural yields, even desertification in some cases. It's a pretty bleak picture.
It's unsettling to think about the long-term consequences. And there was this one comparison in the document that really stuck with me. It talked about the difference in food safety monitoring between the U.S. and developing countries. I mean, we have this whole system in place here to ensure our food is safe to eat, and it's something a lot of us take for granted.
Yeah, for sure.
But in many parts of the world, that safety net simply doesn't exist.
Exactly.
So what does that mean for people in those areas?
Well, it means they often face this impossible choice. Eat contaminated food and risk getting sick, or go hungry. I mean, there just aren't the resources for proper testing and monitoring, and in many cases, there's no system in place to even alert people to potential dangers.
It's awful.
It really is. It's a systemic issue that needs urgent attention.
Yeah. And sadly, this problem is only going to get worse, isn't it?
Unfortunately, that's what the document predicts. With the rise of urbanization, we're likely to see an increase in pollution-related deaths. It's a trend we need to reverse, and fast.
So what can we do? What steps can we take to mitigate this impending crisis?
Well, the document puts a lot of emphasis on sustainable urban development. Things like creating more green spaces, investing in efficient public transportation, and transitioning to clean energy sources. It also stresses the importance of pollution control measures like stricter regulations on emissions and investing in cleaner technologies.
Those are all great points. But it's not just about how we produce things, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. It's also about how much we consume. Our consumption patterns play a huge role in this, and that's something we all need to be more mindful of.
So it's a call to action for all of us then, both individually and collectively.
Exactly.
We've covered a lot of ground today: contaminated water, toxic air, the far-reaching impacts of soil pollution. It's clear that pollution isn't just an environmental issue. It's a major public health crisis.
Absolutely. And it's a crisis that demands a global response.
And, one thing that really stood out to me is the role of developed nations.
Right.
I mean, given our history of industrialization, we have a particular responsibility to lead the charge in protecting the environment and promoting sustainable practices. We can't just sit back and expect others to solve this problem.
I completely agree.
Well, this deep dive has been pretty eye-opening, to say the least. It's a lot to take in, but it also, it makes you think, how can we strike a balance between economic development and environmental protection? How can we ensure a healthier future for everyone? It's not an easy question to answer, but it's one we all need to grapple with. Not just policymakers and scientists, but each and every one of us.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play.
And maybe a good place to start is by taking a look at our own consumption habits, seeing where we can make changes in our own lives, even small ones, because they can add up.
Yeah, every little bit helps.
Absolutely.